So with that, allow me to introduce our author and co-host, Drs. Jason Karlawish and Barbara Grosz. Dr. Karlawish researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and the neurosciences. He's obviously the author of The Problem of Alzheimer's, but also the novel Open Wound, the tragic obsession of Dr. William Beaumont. He's written essays for the New York Times, Washington Post, Forbes, The Hill, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Locally, he's a professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy and neurology at University of Pennsylvania, and co-director of the Penn Memory Center, which is how many people here today know him. Dr. Grosz is Higgins Research Professor of Natural Sciences in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University. She's made groundbreaking contributions to the field of artificial intelligence and co-founded Harvard's Embedded Ethics program. But her journey here today began in November of 2008 when her brother emailed to say that he made an appointment with Dr. Karlawish for their mother. She recalled that appointment as being an important turning point, not just in her mother's care, but also in her family's ability to provide care and to cope with their own new set of challenges, which you'll hear many stories like that in this book. So with that, welcome to our author and host.
Thanks, Terry. Great to be here.
Yes, thank you. Thought I might just kick us off by first starting Dr. Karlawish to say that it's an honor for me to join you in this book launch. Since our first meeting, when my brother, sister, and I brought my mother in for an assessment, and throughout almost a decade, you always called her Mrs. Grosz. You always spoke gently, no matter what she did, and you taught us about respect for the autonomy and the person she was, regardless of what she said or did. Your care improved her life, and it enabled us to deal much better with Alzheimer's. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure taking care of your mother.
Thank you. Thank you. She loved you. So I just want to say about the book before I ask a question that it's amazing in its scope, a wonderful, wonderful tapestry woven from many, many threads, interleaved stories that gets you really a good picture of today's Alzheimer's problem. There's history, there's biography, there's patient stories, there's the quagmire we're in. It's not a how-to book, but it serves this important foundational setting that imparts a broad understanding of what can help us to figure out what to do for friends and family with mild cognitive impairment, with Alzheimer's disease, and also tells us what we as a society needs to do. As I mentioned to you earlier, we could dive deeply into any one of the threads of the book, but I want to try and cover most of the turf. So let me begin, though, by asking you a question about history, because the scholarly history that you present of more than a century of medical research is just astonishing. And clinical and biomedical research, the scientists involved, world events. So I learned, and I hope you'll elaborate on this for people listening, that at the end of the 19th century, Germany had psychiatrists. The rest of the world had alienists, because people with dementia were thought to be alienated from the world. And there was almost the same kind of neurology as now. And then a century almost of stasis and backsliding. So tell us why this history is important to you, why you put it in the book, what it teaches us. And I hope you'll tell us also a bit about Alzheimer and about Oscar Fisher. They were neuropathologists and clinician extraordinaire, and their collaboration is such a model for today's science, and it tells us what works and what doesn't. So they move senility from a condition of old age, for those of us with gray hair, to being a brain disease. So please tell us about that and why it matters.
Yeah, it matters because I'll tell you why it matters, and then I'll tell you a bit about what I found. As much as these were events in the past, a century ago, they are warnings about how fragile science is. It really, as powerful as science is, boy, the last 12 months has taught us that, in less than a year, we developed 3 effective vaccines. But I think we also saw in this past year how fragile science is, namely when it is in the hands of, society, culture, the politicians. And that is what happened with Alzheimer's disease. And I had this sort of revelatory moment, I remember, about 2 years ago doing the research of the early history. And I was kind of planning that to be fairly quick and dispense with it, because I was taught, oh, they said senility was the common cause of dementia, and it's just extreme aging. And then there's this rare thing called, well, it came to be called Alzheimer's disease, and it's rare, it's in early onset. And that's what I was taught. But when I read the primary source literature, how they had translated into English, because I don't read German, I had this revelation that actually Alois Alzheimer's in like 1906, 7, 8, 9, 10, Oscar Fischer, Max Belchowski, and others were onto a very interesting set of findings. And that was that they were looking at the brains of persons who had dementia and concluding that the persons with what was called senility and the persons with this mysterious, rare early onset actually had a lot of similar findings and were beginning to talk like extremely modern physicians, like the way we started to talk in the 90s and the 80s, that Alzheimer's disease is not just a rare disease, but it's probably one of the causes of what we had been calling just extreme aging senility. They were doing fabulous work. And then, as you point out, it all stopped. So why did it stop? And it has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with, they went down the wrong path or they disagreed. It has everything to do with politics and culture. And it's they were all German. They were German nationals, German speaking. German was their language. They published in German. But as we know, beginning in 1914, Germany began to fall apart. The war, following the war, the social and economic collapse, dark nationalism, anti-Semitism. And I chronicle in the book how those events just simply cast the disease into the dark ages. And then it gets, I will say, you have to laugh, amusing when things come to America, because the Freudians take over. And they didn't have much interest in biological basis of disease. And I'm not castigating Freudian theories, but the dominance of Freudian theories really left dementia also in a kind of just a forgotten world. And that was the 20th century until about 1980.
Yeah, it's really astonishing. And something to be mindful of as we look at where science is going now.
Exactly.
I want to turn. I'm going to kind of mix up the order of things here, but you talked about how fast we got the vaccine, and there have been many announcements of promising news flashes of promising treatments. There was a story, I think, earlier this week about a successful new drug story that came out from Lilly. I will say, when I read it, I thought, well, things are getting more nuanced now, but we really have no cure yet. And one of the things I think is really important in the book, and I want to talk about from several angles, is your urging that we think about care as well as cure. But here, I think it was also interesting to me that you point out that Alzheimer's disease is really a complex, heterogeneous disease. Right. It is, and this is gradually. I had one of those aha moments, and I thought, wow, it's sounding more and more like cancer. It's not one thing with every drug is going to treat. And I turned the page, and there you had said this. So maybe say a little bit about care and cure and how they are as equals in importance.
Yeah, it's interesting. The field, I came to really empathize with the Alzheimer's activists, like namely the families that put together the organization that would ultimately come to be known as the Alzheimer's Association. They were really up against some really tough cultural events, namely, unlike cancer and heart disease in 1980, when they got together, there was vast misunderstanding about what is dementia, how's it different than Alzheimer's disease, et cetera. And you can see in their early founding that they were really struggling with how to raise awareness, how to advance the medical model for diagnosis and treatment, and how more broadly to improve care, namely to improve the quality of long-term care. And what they struggled with was, if we make it about improving care, namely for persons with dementia writ large, we lose the disease focus. And if we lose the disease focus, we lose the sort of get Congress to get the NIH to fund the research to figure out how to cure this. And so in some sense, it became sort of a tension of messaging that and the group actually divided. And in fact, the original founders of the association, some of them broke away and would go form what would become called the Family Caregiver Alliance, namely dedicated to the needs for caregivers. But the association would make a strategic choice to try and advance the case for care, certainly, but also really to advance the case for cure. They would never say care and cure are against one another, but they were struggling with this. We've got to get Congress to care, no pun intended. But to get them to care, we've got to focus on this disease, and focusing on the disease means, figure out how to, quote, cure it. And so it would create this weird tension that still haunts the field, which is if we so were desperate to get attention, whereas everyone knows what cancer is and heart disease is, that the field would find itself in these moments of weird tensions between, as I say, care versus cure. Well, I would argue now, I think we've arrived. I mean, it's been just about a half a century, 40 years, and I think awareness has been raised, okay? And it is probably time to sort of walk away from that conflict. And as I point out in the book, recognize how far we've come with recognition of this is a problem and it's a disease, but it's a complicated disease. And that's the thing I point out in the book, that there's one and only one word in some sense that summarizes the advances we've made, which is heterogeneity. The thing that we thought was just a simple set of two pathologies is actually far more complicated. And you often will find researchers talk about not Alzheimer's disease, but Alzheimer's diseases in the plural. And I think many researchers share what you concluded before you read my conclusion, which is we ought to think about this like we think about cancer. That there are some types of cancer that are highly amenable to early detection and treatment, and others which unfortunately are ruthlessly mortal. And that, I think that's the world that we will find ourselves in. Namely, some of us have the treatable form, and some of us have the partly treatable form, and some of us have the, for now, kind of untreatable form. But I'd rather be in that world and its complexities than a world with absolutely no options to arrest the natural history of cognitive decline.
Yeah, I agree. So one other thing that struck me, and I will kind of butcher the probabilities here, but I heard a talk on treatments for cancer, and every time I read a news flash about a treatment, a possible drug treatment for Alzheimer's, I think of this, where on average in the study, and I'm pretty sure it was a stage 3 study, 50% of the people, let's say, who were treated had a remission and did well. It turned out with a certain genetic composition, 90-some% did well. And if you didn't have that, it was maybe 10%, maybe 0, maybe nothing. And I'm hoping, and I wonder if you are too, that people will become sophisticated enough about Alzheimer's disease that they'll begin to look not just at the average, because averages can be very misleading, but at where it works and where it doesn't work. So do you see that happening?
I do. And in fact, I think the Lilly study that you mentioned earlier that was released in publication form in the New England Journal of Medicine just last Saturday, I think heralds this dawn of a biomarker drug redefinition of the disease. What I thought was very interesting about the donanemab study, that's the name of the drug, donanemab, kind of like yogurt. I just have to say that because just to get it out of my head.
Yeah. Why do all these drugs have this UMAB kind of syllable?
I'll explain that actually. Well, yeah, because what they did was target a precise range of one biomarker, tau, the tangles, and requiring, of course, the presence of the other biomarker, amyloid. And actually, the most fascinating bit of data from that study was, and it's a phase 2, so they do another study to validate this, that the more tau you had, it looked like the less responsive you were to the drug. That's getting at a very nuanced slicing and dicing of the disease based on your biomarker results and your probability of responding. The AB ending, donanemab, bapineuzumab, solanezumab, et cetera, it all refers to, and I chronicle in the book, the really just inspiring science that discovered a completely new paradigm to go after the disease right around the turn of the century, into this century, of going after amyloid as though it was a protein that we would target with antibodies. harnessing the immune response. And I described the work of Dale Schenk. And that work that opened up that paradigm of antibodies after amyloid, the paper that he wrote and published on that, and colleagues from Elan Pharmaceuticals, was so spectacular when it came out in 2000 that it made the national news. And what was interesting, of course, was that it was a study in transgenically modified mice, not in humans, but it was so paradigm shifting that it would make the national news. And I dug up in my primary source research some folks who said the results were so inspiring that some folks said, oh, they'll have the Alzheimer's problem wrapped up in 5-10 years, so I should probably pivot my research focus. And in brief, I summarized in the book how the initially inspiring results in mice did not turn out to be so spectacular in men. And I think the donanemab study, like others, show us we might be able to tweak that curve of decline, but we're not showing a flattening or a curing. But again, tweaking is better than nothing, but that tweaking presents its own set of challenges, which I talk about as well, particularly sort of ethical and policy challenges.
I just want to say one of the things I love about the book is that you see the people, but you see the science, and then you see the science in context and what it means for the people, what it means for the researchers, and then also how the politics can affect it, and not just the politics of the national scene, but of how healthcare and medical research are funded and how they're supported. And it's really, I think for people who are not, I'm a researcher also in a different area. And, people say to me, well, why this or why that? And I think it really helps give the general public a much better idea of what goes on in medical research and why some things win and some things lose.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time on that in a chapter called Hope in a Plan, and some earlier chapters. The Alzheimer's Association and related advocates were haunted by this just dictum that Congress doesn't do disease of the month funding.
Yeah.
So you can't go to Congress and say, tell NIH to fund asthma research. And you can understand from a congressional perspective why that's the case. Otherwise, your office would be crowded with a line of folks with every disease saying, "Where's my money?" And I was able to read as primary source material the minutes of the board of directors of the association for about about 25 years worth of minutes. And in the very first minutes of the very first board, in the very first set of minutes of the first board meeting, they say there, Congress doesn't do disease of the month funding, so we've got to be really careful about how we lobby. And it would take the advocates a good 30, 40 years to finally pivot and make the argument to Congress to do disease of the month funding, like for AIDS and cancer. And I chronicle in the book, I was able to interview those folks who did that work. It was elegant politics that they did, and they were very strategic about it. And one of the key things was to hint to the reader to go read it is when Obama signed the legislation that authorized that funding, I tried to find a photograph because I thought, of course, there's a photograph of him signing the National Alzheimer's Project Act into law, and nothing. He did it on about ready to leave for his vacation in Hawaii, and it was very deliberate. They didn't want to have this become part of the partisan politics over how we're going to spend our money. And the advocates were very clever. Just keep this under the radar, move it along, make it happen. Because if it becomes part of the partisan politics that right now bother Washington, we're going to get stalled. And it's really brilliant what they did.
It is. And this gives me an opportunity to say that your historical scholarship is really admirable as well. I spent some time, as you know, at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and there's a whole library on women, and I met a lot of historians, and you really dug into this, and there's so much that one can learn from archives, and I was just so happy reading some of this history, and it just gives you a very different perspective.
Well, thank you. I have a very fond memory of, this is back when we used to travel. I was at one of the Alzheimer's meetings in the evening, everyone's on their own, go get dinner, sitting at a bar at a hotel, reading these PDFs of the Alzheimer's Board of Directors meticulously, because you're needle and haystacking it is what you're doing, a lot of it, whatever. But I enjoy that. I think because you really are there, and you get to kind of try to figure out the characters. And boy, it's such a thrill when you find a pearl, you know.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh my God. And I found some really nice pearls, you know. I
That's-
found this memo about the Gingrich Congress that was given to the association, where they really lay out how bleak things are for us now that the Gingrich Congress is in force in terms of our prospects of raising funds for research and treatment. I have that memo in the book.
Yeah, it's just great. So I want to do a bit of a context shift and in a way talk a little bit about you and ask you to read from the book. So in a wonderful chapter entitled A Correction, you talk about the science advances of the 20th century and also the ethical advances of the 20th century. And many of us lived through those when women and people of color became respected. And when, as you point out, there was this final acceptance that all adults should have be respected and have respect in others. And that really led people to say that the pain of dementia became unacceptable to people. There's also this wonderful sentence that says Alzheimer's disease is the disease of autonomy. And as you know, this is something that my mother struggled with, that we as a family struggled with. I'm just going to read one sentence and then ask you to read the following paragraph, because you talk about healthcare in the United States and you say, our system was explicitly designed not to support care in the community or so-called long-term or custodial care. And then you say it's not just bad long-term care, it's also bad acute care too. And then, you know, there's an issue of the workforce, and you reveal that you didn't go to medical school thinking you were going to be an Alzheimer's doctor. No. So what happened?
Yeah, what happened? I actually left medical school thinking I was going to be a gastroenterologist, but that's a whole other story, which I chose not to put in. Before I read the bit, you're right. The line, Alzheimer's disease is a disease of autonomy. I remember arriving at that conclusion one day in my notebook many years ago and telling my dear friend and colleague Brian James over dinner and he said, and Brian's trained in ethics as well as epidemiology. He's at Rush University. And he's like, that's exactly right. You're right. And what makes this disease fully a disease is that it is an assault on our ability to live our lives as we as individuals want to. And it was only until the late 20th century that value became widely respected. And I think that was the necessary cultural completion to make this a disease. But why did I become an Alzheimer's doctor? So let me tell you a little story. This is from chapter 17 called A Correction. Imagine a healthcare system incapable of diagnosing whether increasing numbers of older adults with weight loss, vague pains, and anemia have cancer, and if they did, incapable of treating their cancer and caring for their common complications such as pain and fatigue. That's the problem confronting older adults with memory loss. The system is broken and a correction is needed to remedy this. It begins with creating a workforce. Simply put, there are millions of patients with Alzheimer's disease, but not enough doctors to take care of them. I'm one of those unusual doctors. I didn't start out as an Alzheimer's doctor. After my residency in internal medicine, I was a fellow at a prestigious critical care medicine training program. But after a year, I dropped out and I switched to geriatric medicine. For 3 years, I was the only fellow in the geriatric medicine fellowship program. Critical care, in contrast, trained a full cadre of fellows selected on the basis of a highly competitive computer-run match. What happened? Friends from medical school and residency asked. Their tone suggested suspicions that I'd been kicked out or committed some egregious misstep. What happened was the healthcare system killed my grandfather. My grandfather was a reasonably healthy 90-year-old man, save for dementia. His internist never offered a clear diagnosis of the cause. The family managed as best we could, making sure he was cooking meals and helping him take care of his bills. No question, his daughter, living on the other side of town, kept him going. But then he fell in his kitchen and fractured his right hip. The ambulance took him to one of the nation's leading academic medical centers. There, he was cared for by a retinue of clinicians at the top of their training and equipped with the best technologies. Everyone did what they were supposed to do, Sure, there were a few missteps or near missteps, such as the surgeon who strode into the room to announce he wasn't eating and so needed a nasogastric feeding tube. She held the skinny tube before my father, who explained that he just fed my grandfather his lunch. With assistance, he could eat. She turned and fled, never to be seen again. Everyone was doing what she thought she should do, but no one was working together. It was the best of care and the worst of care. It was uncoordinated care. It was a medical funhouse run by madmen. Something was really wrong, and I needed to change my profession. That was 1994. Alzheimer's wasn't yet widely recognized as a national crisis, but the hospitals were full of elderly men and women like my grandfather, with families at wit's end, and yet it was hard to assign a cause for the spectacle of well-funded disorganization and deprivation. We were citizens of the richest nation in the world, cared for in some of the finest medical centers. Something was very wrong, but what was it? And so I go on.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just love that paragraph that starts with imagine, because often what changes people's minds is to imagine themselves in a situation they've never been in. Imagine that it was their grandfather and this happened. And really, in this case, imagine it was a disease which everyone knows requires care, and how would you do this differently? So just to keep on the hospital situation for just a moment, that challenge remains, and certainly it raised its head many times with my mother, and I know I was wound up calling you, and you helped me deal with the hospital and the family and everything. And it was often not just because her dementia made her challenging. She couldn't understand what people were saying to her, and they didn't understand what she was saying. And of course, all of us really know that we should always take an ally with us.
Yeah.
But sometimes elderly people, or certainly people with dementia, don't have the right ally to hand. And that was true in my family. We were scattered all over. So tell us a bit about it, and how what you think it will take to what are the systemic changes needed? And because you talk about this in the book.
Yeah, in the part that was in the beginning of part 3, living well in the house of Alzheimer's. And I like that phrase, the house of Alzheimer's, because I want to emphasize that we create the world within which we dwell with Alzheimer's disease. And I'd like it to be less of a fun house and madhouse and more of a house within which we'd like to dwell. And I talk about things we can do right now, to improve care and quality of life. Comprehensive dementia centers, memory centers, network throughout the United States. COVID's taught us that we can do telemedicine. We can do hub and spoke training. I mean, if there's only one copper lining to this miserable pandemic, we've discovered that we can communicate virtually. That's one thing. Number 2, I outline how hospitals need to make a pivot and recreate the way they provide care, proven methods to reduce the risk of delirium, and proven methods to coordinate surgical care to address some of the most common complications, like what killed my grandfather, namely a hip fracture. The research is there, and I chronicle these very brave, just kind of, I'm going to do this even though no one wants me to do it, research to figure out better ways to prevent delirium and treat hip fracture. I interviewed them and chronicled their stories. There are clear roles for technology, the Internet of Things. Our smartphones are effectively monitoring our brains and how well our brains are functioning. We just have to coordinate that data and use it rationally. And then, back to what you noticed with your mother. And we really need a correction in how we communicate with older adults. And I chronicle in the chapter called Not Legally Dead Yet, the experience that many families report to me of witnessing the healthcare profession communicate with their cognitively disabled relatives. And there's one of 2 extremes. They either talk to them like they were a baby, or they don't talk to them at all, neither of which are acceptable. And I chronicle work done by investigators to improve how we communicate with older adults, to respect a reality. Many of them have impairments such that you don't want to rely on solely their decision making, because they would make very bad decisions. But many of them can still make decisions, and no matter what, human dignity demands you talk to an adult like an adult. And I go after the baby talk thing. The last time I attended at the hospital, I remember finally telling the residents, I don't want any more baby talk people, please, no more up talking, hello, Mrs. Grosz. No. You walk into the room and you say, hello, Mrs. Grosz, or Professor Grosz, or however, and I like them to imagine, what if Judge Ginsburg was admitted to the hospital? You surely wouldn't walk in and baby talk Justice Ginsburg, would you?
We we certainly hope not. Yeah, I have some wonderful memories of some awful memories, but also some wonderful memories when my mother came. Her real self was there, and it just came out when somebody didn't communicate with her as though she was a responsible adult. It's very, very important, and communication is important across healthcare. So let me again shift a little bit into clinical care itself. So one of the surprising discoveries for me in the book was that there is actually a way to determine if someone with memory problems is likely to develop Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
The problem, and I remember thinking, wait, why didn't Dr. Karlawish tell us about that when my mother came in? And I mean, surely that's okay. And I thought, okay, it's like a mystery story. I have to keep turning the pages. I'm going to find this out. And there are, reasons about, the complexity of the test itself.
Barbara, I felt particularly bad with your mother because I knew I could get an amyloid scan on her, but I couldn't get one on her because I couldn't get her into a research study because it wasn't clinically available. Getting repeated FDG PET scans.
And also, for anyone who's had an MRI, I mean, I'm not sure she would have been able to sit still long enough to do it. But anyway, but there's also the challenge of how you communicate the results to patients and their families. And I think there's some wonderful stories of your own evolution as a physician in clinical care, as you yourself learn about these difficult conversations and how to have them. And I'm reminded of the story of the woman in the tower, which was really quite moving. And then also your distress when, having told a patient what the future looked like, that she and her daughter just disappeared. So maybe you could tell us a bit about the stories of your evolution, how they impacted you and what you did, because we just need a lot more people to do that.
Yeah, the first part of the book, it's called Alzheimer's Unbound. Kind of thinking of Prometheus Unbound, maybe, but that's perhaps a bit pretentious. But it's about how actually I was fortunate, I guess, to live through a revolution in the way we understand Alzheimer's disease, and that revolution is I started out trained with a model that in order to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, first had to diagnose someone with dementia. If they have disabling cognitive impairments, dementia, then the next question is the story of that disabling cognitive impairments the story of what we see with someone with Alzheimer's disease? And it was understood that it was only a probable diagnosis until death, when an autopsy could show what the pathologies were. Kind of a gothic horror story. In other words, I'm only going to be able to tell you definitively what caused your dementia until you're dead, so you'll never really know. And then what began to happen in the course of the 20th century, and I chronicle this, is two discoveries. One was the discovery of this condition called mild cognitive impairment, cognitive inefficiencies, not disabilities, but persons with that condition, the researchers at Mayo found, were at higher risk of developing dementia. And I was able to interview those researchers, and it's a fabulous story of, at the time, a bunch of young guys who kind of got corralled into this grant at the Mayo Clinic that they kind of didn't want to do, maybe, and whatever. And the rest is just this wonderful history. And the Mayo Clinic, I chronicle because it's a fascinating setting, and I almost don't think the research they did could have been done as well as they did it had it not been at the Mayo Clinic, and I explain why in the book. Yeah. And then the second big event was Bill Klunk and Chet Mattis, somewhat older and somewhat younger researchers who got together at the University of Pittsburgh. And despite everyone saying you're trying to image the garbage can, it's not a receptor ligand interaction, and all these other complaints, and the troubles getting grant funding, they were hell-bent to figure out how to image amyloid in a living brain. And that event, I think, was probably one of the revolutionary events in this history, because what they were able to do is say, you no longer have to wait till you die to see amyloid. More importantly, the methods they developed would be usable for other radio tracers, which is why we can now see tau in the brain of a living human being. And I remember in the interview, I got, those were fun chapters to write. The Olympics of Pharmacokinetics was one of them. And I remember they said when they put the first image of a Pittsburgh compound B amyloid scan on the screen at the Alzheimer's meetings in Stockholm in 2002, they said it was like when a ball is hit in a baseball park and you know it's going to go out of the park, and the audience kind of goes, ah, you know, it's going to hit that park. Well, you know, it's all inspiring science. And you're right. When I saw your mom, I could have gotten an amyloid scan, but Medicare wasn't paying for it. Now I know right away people will say, well, no wonder Medicare is so awful, you know, and actually, you know, I dug up the transcripts of the hearings where they debated whether or not to cover amyloid imaging. And it's like reading a play, and it's sort of two camps come together. The camp of those who have dedicated their lives to the diagnosis and treatment and care of persons with Alzheimer's, and the camp of those who have dedicated their lives to the rational prescribing of therapeutics. And the one could not talk to the other. And you realize that the Alzheimer's field had really not been able to make a case for the value of their diagnostics in a way that was translatable to very smart people who thought about value. And they said, there's not enough evidence to support the value of this amyloid scan in clinical practice. And, you know, it's a good example of, if they let me do it, I'd do it responsibly. But if they let the wide community of American medicine use it, they would probably abuse it. So, you know, it's a story that is as much about progress in science as it is about, you know, science interacting with our healthcare system.
Right.
And so, yes, we have arrived now at a redefinition of the disease. And I chronicle that in the whole first part of the book, the biomarker definition of Alzheimer's disease, which is why we're able to have these studies like the donanemab study, the aducanumab study, and all those other studies, because they're based on this biomarker model of the disease. And, you know, I think it's only a matter of time. I would predict probably in the next several years, we'll be using those biomarkers more in clinical practice. The economies of scale are beginning to translate them into clinical practice now, such that they're more affordable. But of course, the missing actor in the wing is that drug, the statin for the brain, as people like to say, that will you know, slow down progression.
Yeah. And in the meantime, understanding how to communicate with people will be important.
Yeah, no, you point out. I mean, the first case, one of my first cases of delivering a biomarker result to someone with MCI was a disaster. And I chronicle the sad story of Rita Phillip and her daughter, where, you know, all the stigmas of dementia poured into their lives. And, you know, although she had mild cognitive impairment, but I said it was caused by Alzheimer's because I had a biomarker test. And as I chronicle in the book, she wanted nothing to do with me. And her daughter actually said to me, I fear my mother becoming a zombie someday. That's exactly the word she used, a zombie. And I will never forget that, the harm I wrought on them. And you know, you learn from your patients.
Yes. Indeed. So, so you talked about technology a bit earlier, and since I'm a computer scientist, there are a couple of questions I have to ask. We're a bit short on time, so I'm gonna put them together. But you talk in the book both about robot pets. They come in all varieties now, and you talk about smartphone tracking devices. And one of the things I also quite like about the book is that you're very nuanced about those things. You know, there are people who talk about robot pets. You don't need caregivers at all anymore. The Spady seal will make somebody feel better. That's just saying to everybody who's listening, that is not true. And then smartphone tracking devices, and we've seen this with coronavirus, in fact. You know, they're often thought about as doing surveillance, and yet what you're talking about is really cognitive health intelligence.
Yeah.
And I just wish you would, and in both of these cases, technology really can help, but we need to be cognizant of what it can and can't do. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I chronicle in the book the work by a very inventive, sort of preternaturally youthful investigator in Oregon, who's sort of wired up people's houses and has elegant data showing how changes in daily activities predict incipient cognitive decline, computer use, walking speed, etc. So we really have in our possession, we just have to sort of organize our technologies, the ability to detect incipient cognitive impairment or its progression, not based on coming into the clinic and having hour-long interviews and whatnot, but just downloading the behaviors that our smartphones and other devices can measure. That's very promising, but of course it's an enormous intrusion into the privacy of our daily lives, as well as how we would translate that into clinical use. But I think those are surmountable challenges. I think the larger challenge is what you raised with respect to robots. So our ability to make machines have moral agency, the ability to think and decide is really elegant, and we should look to a future where we have robots that are pretty darn smart. And I play a thought experiment in the book. Imagine if Ronald Reagan, when he had his dementia, had a robot that was caring for him, correcting him, answering his questions, etc. The one thing that robot won't have is emotional agency. That robot cannot be programmed to do the thing that only humans can do. And we mustn't forget that. And I think that the events of the last year, you're right, Barbara, have taught us the promise of technology for surveillance and tracking. Absolutely. But they also taught us the value of humans taking care of humans. And if you take away humans, people suffer. And, I think we have to have a long, hard conversation about the degree to which we think that robots will solve our problems. They will solve some of our problems. They're wonderful machines. But a robot can't discern what someone's needs are and respond to them with that kind of emotional recognition. Now, maybe someday, Barbara, our colleagues will develop those robots that are fully human, but there's something about being human to take care of the disease of humanity. And we mustn't forget that. And that's why I think a big theme in the book is we have got to support America's caregivers. We have $1 billion cost of caregiving in America, namely the unpaid wages of mostly women and spouses providing care for the millions of people with disabilities from dementia and other diseases. We have no long-term care social insurance program in place to support them. Most other nations do. And it's only going to get worse as families shrink in their size, more people get old, more people develop disabilities, and we extend the period of disability with treatments that slow down the progress of disease, slow the progression. So we have to have a national conversation, which we had, and I chronicle in the book, up until about 1988. We were almost ready to have a long-term care social insurance program, but it fell apart. And you can really, I chronicle how and why that conversation fell apart. But we need to support humans who take care of humans, and not simply put our faith in robots and toy cats and pet seals and smartphones.
Absolutely. I'm in complete agreement with you. And I'm really glad for some of the last remarks you made, because I know we're going to need to switch to the Q&A soon. And I really wanted to get out some of what you talk about as the cost to society and to others. But let me just give me another minute to say that I do research in artificial intelligence, and the community is becoming aware of this, and I think there will be some reports coming out in the next year that talk about care and caring and where there's an essential human role. And and I hope that will build a community there.
That's fabulous. I know you will send me that when it comes out.
Absolutely.
If there's a take-home message to the folks here, and that's in the book, is, America is, we have a free labor problem. We paint the story of why Alzheimer's is a crisis largely by its economic costs. And I think that's a very correct story. The three-digit billion-dollar cost to America's families, the money that is lost from not going to work, paying others to provide the care, money that's spent that could otherwise be for savings, et cetera. But we have made no effort as a society to provide any protection from those massive fiscal risks. And that's, I think, inappropriate, and we need to address that.
I agree. So I guess I see that Terrence has come in, so
Hey,
maybe
Terry.
I can do a wrap up that says there were a lot of other topics. I hope they come out in the Q&A. I just want to thank you, Dr. Karlawish, for an enlightening and inspiring book, for the insights it imparts to all of us involved in different ways with care for people who have Alzheimer's, and also for being such a wonderful storyteller, because in the end, this book left me inspired to take action, not despondent about the way things are. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara. It's such a pleasure. Terry.
All right,
Greetings.
we got a number of questions in the chat box, and I will encourage people, if so moved, please feel free to keep asking questions as we go, and I'll try to catch as many as possible. I'll kick off with what I think is my favorite question in here, which is, are you a writer who practices medicine or a physician who writes?
I'm a chimera. I can't be the one without the other. And I wrote an essay about that, about my typical day. I mean, fundamentally, my medical practice is about helping people tell stories and make sense of the story of living with cognitive impairment. If you read my chart notes, they're often very narrative based. So my very practice of medicine is wrapped up in narrative. So I guess I'm a bit of both, and the one without the other. Yeah, it'd be like cutting off my right arm or cutting off my ear to spite my face, or whatever the expression that writers came up with.
Another question gets into the system of healthcare and confusion about where caregivers should go when they have the first signs of memory problems in a loved one. Should they be calling a geriatrician or a neurologist? How do they know the right direction to go?
The Alzheimer's Association has a really good, as well as the National Institute of Aging's Alzheimer's Disease Education and Referral page. So Alzheimer's Association, or NIA's ADEAR, ADEAR, have very well-written, pithy summaries of sort of warning signs, things that signal you should get evaluated. The first step in that is to present that problem to your internist, your primary care doctor. But if you're not getting the answers that make sense of it, that's when it's time to ask for, could we see someone who's a specialist in working up memory problems? So that's the usual progression that should be taken. The one caveat I'd put is, if the problems have developed in a rapid way, et cetera, over time, it needs urgent attention. And by rapid, I mean, 3-4 months, things like that. Yeah.
Another one gets into, there are actually a couple comments on the topic of racial disparities in healthcare in the United States.
Yeah.
And looking at the differential treatment of dementia of men versus women and white versus people of color. Are you aware of researchers who are studying those disparities today?
Yeah, the book's in 4 parts. The 4th part of the book is called A Humanitarian Problem. And I profile a researcher at Rush University, Lisa Barnes, she's a psychologist. And she's a fascinating story, both of her science as well as her own life. And Dr. Barnes started out as a psychologist of the view that the brain is the brain is the brain. Namely, it's about lesions, and the lesions cause a problem, and it's a very lesion-based model and Lisa is Black, and she grew up in a very integrated community in Chicago, enjoyed a world with minimal amounts of discrimination. And in the book, I chronicle how she went to Wellesley in Massachusetts, went to Boston to check out the city, and experienced microaggressions of racism as to the degree that she would eventually go to transfer to a historically Black college in Atlanta. And that changed her focus of her research to focus on how social and economic determinants affect the brain. It's not just that the brain is the brain is the brain, but the brain is the mind that's in an environment. And I chronicle the results of research that show how social and economic disparities are clearly been documented to contribute to causing poor brain health. In other words, flip that around. If you can give people opportunity and access, we have shown that those who have enjoyed opportunity and access over the last 4 decades have a reduced risk of developing dementia. That's in the absence of any treatment that can target the pathologies. And of course, in America, sadly, the story of social and economic opportunity is woefully tied up into matters of race. And then finally in the book, I do have a whole section as well on the discovery of mild cognitive impairment, which was so reliant on developing precise norms for the cognitive tests. Well, when those norms were developed in Minnesota amongst a predominantly older Norwegian population, and then they were taken down to Florida in a community who had suffered the quality of education that was delivered in segregated schools, the norms no longer worked, and they had to recreate the norms. And so that revealed yet again how these disparities that begin in childhood ramify across the generations and into aging. To me, it reiterated a call to action about how, for example, at our memory center, we've implemented measures of social determinants of health as part of our standard battery to better understand brain health.
There's a question about sort of public representation of dementia, and this person doesn't use the word stigma, but getting into the stigma of dementia. And what are the ways that researchers, clinicians, and advocates can fight that focus, the way that people, kind of the pictures that they see of
tidy up our language, tidy up our images. In the book, I chronicle some rather vivid examples of the stigmas that surround Alzheimer's disease, the stigmas that surround dementia. I chronicle how Lou Ruvo built a building in honor of his father, who had dementia. He was a very wealthy man, and so he was able to build a building for an institute. And in the design of the building, the waiting rooms were actually individual tranquility rooms, because he didn't want anyone to see another person who had dementia, because his father had seen people when he had dementia and was very upset about it. And I thought to myself, wow, that's like architecturally recapitulating the stigmas of the disease. Let's separate people and hide them, so they can't see each other. I talk about the zombie trope that haunts the field, and how that's even recapitulated in ads used to promote and raise awareness, where individuals are depicted looking like they're the Phantom of the Opera, with amyloid coating their brain, coating their skull. So, for a disease of humanity, an identity, is it no surprise that our culture and the way we talk about it affects the way we think about it? It should be no surprise, and we need to clean up our language. I'll leave at this point. I myself have been through that journey. I used to talk about my patients as demented. Oh, he's demented. That patient has dementia. That patient is demented. And I don't say that now. I say, oh, that's a person who's living with dementia. And in my writing, that's what I write. In the book, I struggled with that. I would say like patients and whatnot, because I am a doctor and they are my patients, and yet they are persons. And you'll notice in the book, I sort of toggle between patients and persons, because I guess maybe that's the writer and doctor in a kind of a conversation, if you will.
So getting into working with families too. This person works in healthcare and says it sees a lot of denial among family about what are kind of serious problems, and how do you work with the caregivers to sort of teach them the reality of the situation?
Yeah, well, first you work with the caregivers. I mean, I know that sounds sort of cheeky for me to say, but I mean, one of the whole structures of our memory center is a recognition that when you have a person with cognitive impairment, you need to have others around them. Their autonomy is interlaced. It's a disease of autonomy, but this autonomy is a relational autonomy that interweaves people. And so we have, as a sort of matter of practice, when someone comes in, particularly someone who has cognitive impairment, who else is there? We call them the caregiver because that's the word that's used. And we pay just as much attention, if you will, to them and their needs as we do to the patient. I will add that our ability to do that is only because of a generous philanthropic gift that allows us to support the social services we provide, which is an indictment of the American healthcare system, such that you can't routinely provide that kind of education and training to a family member about what's the problem, where you're at now, what to expect in the future, and how to address it. And, you know, if you had diabetes, you show up to a endocrinologist and you can get a prescription to see a nutritionist to get counseling and advice about diet. And I could run down the list. We don't have that ability right now, routinely available in the United States of America, to educate and train family members for how to live with and interact with someone who has cognitive impairment. And so, you know, it's no wonder that families are afraid, because what they hear out there are stories of neglect, indifference, you know, shoulder shrugs, etc. But these are all fixable problems. You know, we could set up a national network of dementia centers that would provide the kind of services and supports that families need. France has done it. The Netherlands has done it. Granted, they're smaller countries, but I mean, this is America. We can do it.
That's a nice lead in actually to this next question, which is about, you referenced some of the history of European research and its influence on American research today. But what's your understanding of in Europe or Asia, other parts of the globe, in terms of what they're doing differently in treatment and research and care?
What's most impressive is around care. In research, I think there's a general harmony amongst the countries about developing and advancing biomarker discovery. It is interesting, in Australia, they have copied our biomarker model of discovery, but their biomarker cohort study, big study modeled after ours, explicitly includes measures of family caregiving services, supports, and needs. It's very, you know, ours, big one, doesn't, but anyway. But I think the big difference is when you look across countries is the degree that differences in how countries set up their long-term care services and supports. Germany has had a long-term care social insurance program since the early 1990s. It's paid for out of a payroll tax. It's self-sustaining and supporting. The Netherlands has a network where all primary care physicians have adequate time to perform the necessary workup for an older adult with a cognitive complaint, and mechanisms for referral for the complicated cases that need a second opinion, need more detailed workup. It is routine in the Netherlands, after a clinician makes a diagnosis of dementia, it is routine that you meet with a care manager to make a care plan. It is routine that access to an adult day activity program is made available. And those adult day activity programs are designed not in nostalgic ways to look like the Netherlands in 1930, which I talk about in the book, the nostalgia type communities, but they're interesting. They're designed according to the tastes of people. Like, some of the programs are set up in a woodsy environment for people who are more bucolic in their desires. Some of them are set up in a very kind of neoclassical look. And it's about taste. It's about finding environments that fit with that kind of person. Scotland has wide access to care managers for all residents of Scotland. You know, when you look at how other countries have organized care and returned to these shores, you know, we're still kind of stuck in 1965 when the Medicare statute was signed into law, explicitly prohibiting payment for, quote, custodial care. That's the line. It's in between payment for eyeglasses and plastic surgery. Those are two things that Medicare won't pay for, you know, and that very term custodial care, as if these people were buildings and whatnot. But that's still statute in America. That has not changed in some 50 years now, 60, going on 60 years. It is a shortcoming that we have to correct.
Just the timing of the book is interesting with the pandemic, and you've talked a lot about sort of the big picture lessons learned, and including telemedicine, et cetera. But on a personal level, for someone living with dementia, what kind of impact have you seen in patients in terms of how the pandemic has exacerbated, or, you know?
Yeah, COVID-19 has been a horrible natural experiment in what happens when you take away care in the long-term care residential facilities and in the inpatient settings, where visitor policies essentially restricted all access. We saw what happens when those who remain, namely the paid caregivers, the professionals, have to do all the work. And it vividly shows that there's caregiving is not just tasks. It's not just bathing, dressing, grooming, and feeding someone. It's not just cooking a meal and putting it on a plate and serving it to them. There's something about caregiving around the sort of discernment and reading of the other person, figuring them out, communicating with them effectively. motivating them, calming their fears. That gets back to the point Barbara and I were talking about, there's just so much robots can do. And COVID showed that when the caregivers were kept out of the long-term care, residential long-term care, when caregivers were kept out of the hospital, we have seen the consequence: excess deaths, delirium, prolonged hospitalizations. I have heart-rending emails I've received from caregivers all around the country telling me of just these stories as a result of that. So that's what COVID taught us, is teaching us. And I predict the one good thing I think that will come from that is, I think that visitor policies will no longer just be hours of, when you can come and that's it. But I think that they will begin to, and we're seeing this now, acknowledge that some visitors are not just visitors, but they're essential caregivers. And we need to give them access. We need to recognize their value for care. They're just not there making a social call. We need to design hospital rooms that they can stay there and be there. So, I'm cautiously optimistic that, frankly, America has woke to caregiving now, and the need to support caregivers.
That's terrific. We are already past the hour here. We have some other notes that I will address directly, but I think that's.
I can linger for a bit and answer some more questions. If this was live, we would. If this was live, I'd still hang around the stage for a bit. We can go for a few more. Do you think?
Sounds great.
Okay.
All right. Let me pull these up. One question is in your clinical experience, do you frequently see a correlation between patients who are embracing healthy living habits and those who enjoy longer years of higher functioning, slower decline?
Yeah, no, again, in the book, I chronicle the research that has shown over 40 years, the risk of developing dementia has declined. And there's still a lot of people with dementia. They're just not as many as we thought there would be. And why that is about access and opportunity. And, access to good healthcare, particularly cardiovascular care. And a lot of cardiovascular care beyond stents and statins and other drugs is about healthy lifestyles. I would urge those who want to learn what's a healthy lifestyle for your brain and what's kind of not, and maybe not so worth the effort, to go to the AARP's Global Council on Brain Health, Global Council on Brain Health, and I'm a member of it, full disclosure. But we have summarized the state of the literature on what's known to and said to preserve brain health: music, activities, brain games, exercise, sleep, and summarized it into concrete, sort of very accessible summary recommendations. The most recent report was on COVID, and before that was on delirium, by the way. So Global Council on Brain Health, AARP, go to that website.
I'm going to just package two of these questions here, because one of them was about how you can explain the presence of biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, but no dementia. And then combining that with another question on here about misdiagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. We know there are various diseases that can cause dementia, and you can have biomarkers but not have cognitive impairments. And sort of how is that changing now? Where do you see that going in terms of how accurate a diagnosis is and what they're actually diagnosing anymore?
Yeah, well, I mean, I chronicle in the book, particularly in the first part of the book, Alzheimer's Unbound, the biomarker redefinition of the disease. A neuropathologist will look at an autopsy brain and conclude that the person had Alzheimer's disease because the pathologist sees plaques of amyloid, tangles of tau protein, and evidence that there aren't as many neurons as you would expect. So amyloid, tau, and neurodegeneration. We can see all those three things now in life, in a living human. We can see that. And so, it's the translating that into clinical practice. I chronicle over several chapters the challenges that are presented there. And Barbara and I talked about some of them, namely labeling people who have no impairment with the disease who then experience all the stigmas. I think the future that we have to think about with this disease is to perhaps think about it as being at risk of experiencing cognitive decline. And I think, Barbara and I got at this a bit, that we'll learn information that gives us sort of a relative gradation of, well, how much likelihood over time do I have of developing cognitive impairment? and I hope walk away from just the label of Alzheimer's and all of that facade that surrounds it. And I think there are many other diseases that are pointing us that direction. You know, cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis are also diseases where, you know, we think in terms of risk, and we're trying to avoid certain outcomes like a stroke, a heart attack, a fall with a fracture. Where I think this disease, though, will present some unique challenges, and I talk about it in the book, is the risk that we're looking at here is the risk of losing progressively your ability to exercise your self-determination. And so how to monitor that, how to address it as it occurs, and how to set up a society that allows people still to live well despite those disabilities. And I close the book with some sort of disquieting thoughts. And the last chapter of the book is called The Worlds We End, because I think we're going to enter into a very difficult conversation as a society about when we would stop treatment. Meaning, you know, how long would you stay on aducanumab, donanemab, bapineuzumab, whatever the drug may be? How long would you stay on it as you're developing impairments, as you're developing disability? You know, in physical illnesses, we allow people to quit a drug and treatment whenever they want. And if they're, quote, terminal, they can even choose aid in dying. Now, 40% of the population of the United States has access to physician aid in dying. I talk about the very difficult moral conundrums that were presented when we apply that kind of paradigm to this disease, where, for example, I would argue the last 5 years, you know, the ability to sort of independently, autonomously make the decision to end one's life is very difficult. But I don't think we ought to rush immediately into a culture, and it is a culture that would argue, you know, that one is dying in the early stages of the disease. And I explain in great detail why I think we're walking into a very morally perilous world there. A lot of it comes down to we have to have a much more rich understanding of the mind of persons living with dementia. Even into the advanced stages of the disease, there is a mind still there, and it's a question of how we connect with it. I'm not trying to create some Pollyannish view of this. It's awful, okay? All disease is awful in some way or another, but we have to restore a view of the minds in persons living with dementia. And I close the book with some rather poignant stories of individuals whose mind is discovered, even advanced into the disease. And I remember that, with Barbara, with your mother as well.
On that note, I know we are at time for Dr. Grosz here, so I want to make sure that we let her get her final word in and thank her for her time and effort today.
Yeah, I just hope everyone listening can see both what a fantastic physician, caregiver that Dr. Karlawish is, and also what a great storyteller, and that that all of you will gain as much from this book and that way of having a dialogue with Dr. Karlawish as I have. And for me, what you just said is just a wonderful, I'm sorry I have to leave. I enjoy the rest of the questions, but a wonderful wrap up. That I often said about my mother that what made Alzheimer's, the dementia that she had, worse than any other disease I could imagine, was that every aspect of her life and body was affected. I mean, even moving is affected. You know, other things attack an organ. The brain is the organ that controls everything, and it makes these ethical dilemmas much harder. So thank you again for this honor, and have a great rest of the discussion.
Thank you. Goodbye, Barbara.
Bye.
We're actually pretty close at the end here, but I'll get just maybe 2 more questions in, and then we can close it out. One question is about sort of separating within kind of community conversations and speaking with healthcare providers, how we separate thinking about Alzheimer's disease from psychiatric illnesses, and making sure that they're being treated for the physical components of disease as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The Alzheimer's field, I talk about how they early on, the advocates and others were keen to not have Alzheimer's framed as a mental illness. And part of that is because at the time, psychiatry was very dominated by Freudian psychoanalytic theories of illness. And the association actually, and the advocates were keen to have Alzheimer's disease research situated in the newly created National Institute of Aging. And that's where it is. NIA is the principal funder of the Alzheimer's disease research centers and much of Alzheimer's research, although other institutes certainly fund that research as well. You know, I think, though, that anyone who knows this disease knows it comes not just with cognitive problems, but with problems with emotion, comportment, social cognition. And good care requires a thorough assessment of all the things the brain does. It thinks, it feels, and as Barbara pointed out, it also moves, hence, you know, problems with gait and falls. So, you know, truly, what is an Alzheimer's doctor? It's sort of a chimera, you know, the brain of a neurologist, the courage of a psychiatrist, and the heart of a geriatrician, I like to say. You know?
And I think this could be our last question, and I think it runs with something that we've talked about within the Penn Memory Center, is the label of neurocognitive impairments as being a memory problem. But often there are people who have cognitive impairments, and it's not a matter of forgetfulness, for example, executive function. And what are some other ways that researchers are studying cognitive impairment that's not based on memory? One example was kind of visual perception.
No, in the book I chronicle that, you know, Alzheimer's doesn't have just one presentation, but actually 4 different kinds of presentations. One of them, for example, was what my patient, the sports writer for the Inquirer, Bill Lyon had, and under pressure of performance here. Bill Lyon was he was a hero for speaking openly about his Alzheimer's disease. And his presentation was the visual variant of the disease. Namely, his earliest problems were with depth perception and organizing visual imagery, not so much with memory and problem solving, although later on he would develop some of those problems as well. So a very different presentation. It also can present with a predominant language presentation as well. And I talk about that early in the book. And, you know, clinically, that's incredibly important. And I don't think the field has adequately addressed it, because when we conduct our clinical trials, we tend to lump all those different variants together and measure cognition with one global measure. And I think particularly in early stage disease, where those differences are so marked between those different patient groups, my colleagues and I wondered, may that introduce noise into the way we measure the outcomes of trials? So it's even with the same pathology, it can be a very clinically different presentation of disease. And yes, that's a very hot area of research. In fact, at Penn, to be quite parochial and local about it, that's a topic of great interest, namely the heterogeneity of the clinical presentation of the disease and the correlation between that heterogeneity and the expressions of the pathologies measured with biomarkers and MRI imaging. That's a hot area led by Dr. Wolk and other colleagues here at Penn.
I think that will wrap up our Q&A portion. I want to thank you and Dr. Grosz for time and insight today. And I added to the chat here, but just a reminder for those of you who haven't gotten a copy of the book, you can find it on jasonkarlawish.com is the easiest way to find access to the hardcover, the ebook, the audiobook. And if you have read it, please consider leaving a review on Amazon and or Goodreads. This makes it much more accessible to others who are looking for information on the topic in general. And this event was recorded. The recording will be made available early next week, probably on Tuesday, to the address that you used to register for the event.
Thank you, Terry, so much for hosting. I just want to say to everyone how much of a pleasure it has been working with Terry, a fellow writer, and his team of folks in the communications work. And thank you all so much for coming. I so wish we could be live and together. And someday I know we will be. Maybe we'll even plan a little event where I can sign your books if you get one. And if you do get one, you know, I help spread the word. There's definite mission and in the book. There's definite messaging in the book. And if you share those messages and mission, please spread the word with a review or give a copy to a friend. I really appreciate it. But again, I miss you all. I look forward to when we can all be together in one room celebrating the work we're all doing here at the Memory Center. And so thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.